All right. Welcome, everybody. Department of Internal Medicine Grand Rounds. Today is February 22nd, 2024. Today's session is one of our special sessions every year where we invite a speaker from outside the department to give some insightful conversations around their topic. So today is an update on infectious disease diagnostics and laboratory utilization here at VCU. And our speaker is Dr. Christopher Doern. He's the Director of Microbiology and the Associate Professor of Pathology and Pediatrics. Dr. Doern received his PhD from Wake Forest University School of Medicine and did a fellowship in medical and public health microbiology at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, Missouri. He now serves as the Director of Microbiology here at VCU and has recently taken on the role of co-chair of the Laboratory Utilization Committee. He's going to provide an update. He did a similar talk last year in January, I think it was, 2023. So we'll have some updates on some of those topics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Doern.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so thanks for the opportunity to come back here and give you all an update. This is going to be a bit of a non-linear talk. The goal here really is to update everyone on all the different things we're doing in the laboratory, solicit feedback where appropriate, and really just kind of help educate the environment on the variety of different things that we're doing. I have to say it feels good because we're sort of back from the wilderness. You know, last year we had to talk about COVID. That's all we were thinking about still in the microbiology lab. And we're kind of settling into a little bit of normalcy there. So we've got a fully staffed laboratory. We've got a bunch of young, really energetic folks in the lab. So we're doing some cool stuff now. I'm excited to share with you what we're working on here. So we're going to start, it's going to be sort of a two-part talk. We're going to talk about a lot of the things going on in the micro lab and then end with a discussion about our laboratory utilization committee. Just a few conflicts of interest. None of these should lead to any bias here in this lecture. So just to sort of frame what we do, so we are becoming a hub and spoke model of laboratory medicine, which has become very, very common. It's the idea of centralizing your expertise and your technology and bringing in the microbiology from a variety of different places. So in our laboratory, we now do most of the microbiology for Tappahannock, CMH down in South Hill. We have a New Kent ED, we do all of their micro, and we also support the student health group. That was more true during COVID than it is now, but we do still support those folks when they need us. And all that microbiology comes into the core microbiology campus here. We are looking to decentralize certain things. Technology is advancing. Yes?
Sorry, it's a very short question. Does that mean all the micro specimens from all these different places are transported physically to us?
Yeah. And so this is becoming a pretty common model. So made, I think, originally sort of famous, but the Geisinger group in Pennsylvania does a lot of this. We're trying to model that. It does pose some serious challenges. I've long said that this is the downfall of good microbiology because there's a timeliness, specimen quality, and that's not a popular thing to say out loud as the director of a laboratory that now does this, but we do the best we can to make sure we have couriers that run on schedule, and we think we offset any disadvantage with the advantage of being able to have all that expertise in a place where we can do cutting edge microbiology, but it is a challenge for sure. So today we're going to talk about a variety of different things. Going to just do a general epidemiology update at VCU. One of the things I love about my job is I get to have all the data. So we know everything that's going on with respect to infectious diseases. And there's some interesting stuff kind of no matter what time of year you're talking about. So we're going to just a brief update on that. And then I'm going to update on a couple of changes we've made here recently that we're particularly excited about. We think we've been wanting to do these for a while and have finally got them implemented. So I want to update folks on that. And we'll end with some future directions and a discussion about laboratory utilization. So real quick on some infectious diseases. So something that is particularly timely this time of year is a discussion about respiratory viral infection. This is part of a report that my colleague, Dr. Bryson, and I send out weekly, just updating people on the weekly epidemiology of what's circulating in our area. And so this is a snapshot from some of the figures we show in this. And if you want to be included in this report, just email me and we'll get you added. A couple of interesting things to note. We are on the downside, we think, of flu season, but flu's done an interesting thing this year. So the orange bar here, or the orange line, is flu. And historically, what flu has always done is it goes up and then it just goes down. And usually you'll get a little blip of flu B at the end. So it's usually flu A in the beginning, flu B at the end. But as you can see here in this past year, the previous year, this is really what it does. I don't have the years prior, but It's pretty typical. And this year we've had this weird sort of stagnant epidemiology, and it's actually gone up a little bit, mostly driven by a huge surge in flu B disease. So don't quite know what to make of that. You know, one thing we're really looking at is what is the future of our epidemiology? What's the seasonal curve going to look like now that we have COVID here? And speaking of COVID, it does look like we've settled into this interesting pattern with COVID where we see a little sort of late summer, early fall blip. You saw it here, and in the previous years, we actually saw this too, a little blip. Then it sort of settles down a little bit. The blue line is COVID. And we saw exactly the same thing this year. So here, sort of your late summer, fall blip in COVID, then it kind of settles down and you get another spike there in the winter. So it looks like we kind of have this like bimodal blip there, and RSV is right back on schedule. RSV is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, kind of a November, October spike, and then it just does what it does and goes away. So that's that. One of the interesting things this year is we've seen sort of a separation. Another interesting thing to watch for future years between adult and pediatric disease. The pediatrics have always been the engine that drives a lot of our respiratory viral infection. But as you'll see now, and this is just the past couple of weeks of epidemiology, you can see our pediatric rates are about equal in COVID. So between adult and pediatric disease, about equal. They're a little less actually. RSV, about the same, but there's a departure there in flu. So flu, we're still seeing quite a bit of pediatric disease, not as much in the adult world. Don't know what to make of that, but that's a little bit atypical from what we've seen in previous years. So something just to keep an eye on.
Hey, Chris,
Yes.
does that include people that are asymptomatic that are just getting tested and then become positive?
Yeah, we don't actually, that's included in our report. We do track positivity rate by symptomatic and asymptomatic patients for COVID specifically. That's a catch-all, that data I was just sharing with you there. So I can't differentiate those, but yeah, interesting question. I will say our strategies for asymptomatic COVID testing have changed quite a bit. So I think I know we're doing far less asymptomatic testing. So I wouldn't expect that denominator to be terribly large there. Another one, just kind of a hot topic here recently, at least locally, is Candida auris. If you haven't heard of Candida auris, it's a yeast. It's a Candida species, like Candida albicans, only it's noteworthy in that it's capable of being pan-resistant. And this got everyone's attention some years ago, and it just has taken a while for it to reach the United States firstly, but then also to get to Virginia. So it really has been slow to get to us. We had been cruising along without a case for years and finally had one a couple of years ago. And now it's sort of taken hold in central Virginia. So a couple of things about Candida auris. So it survives really well in the environment. This is probably something that makes it more different than other Candida species. So it can be resistant, but it also survives well in the environment. It's probably not more pathogenic than other Candida species. And I think that's important because you get a lot of these lay press headlines that really kind of dramatically inflate how dangerous this bug is. It's dangerous because it's hard to clean from the environment and it can be pan resistant. So that's not great, but it's not any more pathogenic than other Candida species. And all the same patient populations are at risk. So these are immunocompromised, your most vulnerable patients are the ones that are at risk here. And these are just a few highlights. I also like to pick on the CDC whenever I can. So this is a very nice headline here where they show a salmonella in their Candida auris headline here. So I always like to, helpful edits there for the CDC, I guess. But this epidemiology is interesting. And so this would be true if we were tracking other Candida species as much as we are Candida auris. This would be the same trend here. So what we have here in the dark blue are colonization cases. This is Virginia, and this is the most up-to-date data I have with respect to this kind of data presentation. You can see most of the cases are colonization. The minority are infection cases or clinical cases. And this is, I think, also kind of interesting. And this maybe reflects why we haven't had an issue here at VCU until recently. So this is the epidemiology of Virginia with a heat map, not a heat map, with color-coded by region. So the red is the Northern Virginia area. And you can see prior to this, this most recent time, most of the Candida auris cases were identified in Northern Virginia. But we've seen a shift now where Central Virginia is now the dominant localization of this disease. So it's something that we are now dealing with here at VCU. And as a result, we've implemented here recently a screening strategy for Candida auris I wanted to update folks on. So this was launched back in August, thanks to two of our great technologists, Nikhil Taylor and Siobhan Johnson. So we hold these cultures for 72 hours. It's a slow process. Yeast don't grow as fast as bacteria. We don't do susceptibility testing automatically on them. And the infection control strategy is to do screening for anyone who comes in from a long-term care facility or from an outside hospital. We do have some significant issues in the surrounding areas, we think, with Candida auris. colonization there. And then if we identify a case, we do a point prevalence study. A little bit about our data. So we've done 201 screens. This data is a little bit outdated. This is from December. So we've done 201 screens as of December, 6 positives. So we are picking up some things. The clinical cultures reflect what the Virginia data suggests, which is the majority of these represent colonization. None have been pan-resistant. So that's an important thing that has been nicely surprising. So the big scare is that these are untreatable infections. They're not easy to treat, but we've not seen anything close to the pan-resistant phenotype that we were worried about. And these are, we see them from all different kinds of cultures. You'll notice that we have a decent number of blood cultures that have been positive. This number 71 represents multiple cultures from patients. So this is not number of patients. This just reflects patients that have a number of different cultures that are positive. So maybe not as bad as it appears there by that number, but still a variety of different cultures. Most of these respiratory and urine cultures represent colonization, we think. So shifting gears now away from that into something that we're very excited about to finally be doing. So in May of 2023, we went live with blood culture PCR. I want to set the framework for this because this is something many institutions have been doing and has been well documented to improve patient care. So we're quite pleased to be doing this now. Probably don't need to go into this in great detail here, but as you all know, blood cultures start with phlebotomy. They come to our laboratory and sit on a continuously monitored system. So bacteria in the blood will be monitored for growth every 10 to 15 minutes. When that goes off 24/7, we have a technologist that pulls that off the system and then does a couple of things. Historically, what we've done is a gram stain to make a phone call. Now what we've implemented is the simultaneous performance of the gram stain as well as a PCR here. And this PCR, as I'll show you, can detect, I think, some 43 different pathogens and resistance genes. So it's pretty powerful technology. We also, and this is important, in addition to doing this, we always will do our standard of care. So nothing has changed with that. And so that's important because the system is really, really good. I'm going to share with you the data. It's not perfect. And so it's important that everyone knows that if we catch something where it has been wrong, we will not only identify it the next day, but we will also make a phone call. That's one of the very few things in microbiology, in the laboratory in general. If there's an error, we will call a human and let them know. This is not going to be an email. This is something we take very seriously. So I want to build some trust and faith in the system because it really works quite well. And then following that, our standard of care processes, they just said, will take place. So here's what you guys see. And we were intentional about this. To the environment, it should really look just like our results have always looked, only much, much faster. So this blood culture identification here came from what we call the BCID, it's blood culture identification system. So I'm going to use that acronym here. And we will tell you identification by BCID. And so we will put that into the place where we had always put our identification. So there's no new location. It just comes back much, much faster. And I'll show you the data on that. We are still doing the gram stain and reporting it there. You will also see this sort of secondary test that pops up. This is a reflex that the system is firing for us. And we are not showing you what we see in the laboratory because it's wildly confusing. We have to pause and look at it because it's just the amount of data you're getting from it. I think we decided probably would be too confusing to put out there. So what we do is say this BCID has been done. It was positive. And in the background, we're testing for all of these different pathogens here. And I'm quite pleased with myself here because I got a touch of OCD. When we first built this, it was all over the place. Nothing was lined up at all. And we said, it's got to be better here. So it now is nice and clean and lines up. And so you've got all these different organisms we're testing for. You've got yeast, you've got your gram negatives, your gram positives, and then some resistance mechanisms I'll get into. And the manufacturer would tell you, and the literature would suggest, that this panel should identify about 95% of things we get out of our positive blood cultures. As you'll see, our environment is far more complex than most, and so that's not true for us. And I'll share with you our data here. It does quite well, but it's not 95%. This is what we see in the background. So we've got this, and unfortunately, the way it presents to us, there is a line to help you sort of know what lines up with what, but there's a lot of space between the answer and it being positive here. So we elected to keep that in-house or internal in the laboratory, but this is what we see behind the scenes. And we've made some changes around this. So we implemented it and you learned some things. So one of the things we've decided to do is you've always seen methicillin resistant Staph aureus reported just that way. If it was methicillin susceptible, or if we didn't know, we just called it Staph aureus. And what we've moved towards is we are now 100% confident that methicillin susceptible Staph aureus is methicillin susceptible. So we're calling it that when we know. And we think that's important because we want people to trust that we know this is now methicillin susceptible and you can de-escalate off of vancomycin. So that was an intentional change we made there. And we know that from this BCID panel, it works really well. We also, and I'll show you some of the discrepant results. I want to share with you some of the dirty laundry, I guess, from this assay, where it doesn't do so well. And we've identified some of those things and put into place some safety checks so that we don't make any errors or minimize the errors. And my colleague, Dr. Bryson, and I daily will do rounds in the laboratory. And so we field questions about anything that doesn't make sense on this assay, we're reviewing and hopefully adjudicating so that we get it right. So here's the data. We'll first focus on organism identification. So this review reviewed 587 positive blood cultures. Another thing that speaks to the challenge of our environment is, or the complexity of our patients, is that the literature would say anywhere from 8 to 9% of your blood cultures ought to be polymicrobial. We're at 13%. That's a complex patient population. The error rate in total is 2.9%, which is pretty good by any test metric. So we're at better than 97%. For monomicrobial cultures, we're at 1%. The polymicrobial cultures are where things start to struggle. And this is where we've really tried to intervene, pause. When we see a polymicrobial culture and we see it on gram stain, we'll see it on BCID, we'll say, okay, we got to hold this back and think about things. And if there's any question, we just won't report the BCID results because we don't want to put anything out that's inaccurate. And we think we've been largely successful in virtually eliminating these errors. This is just the raw data, but those should not reach the patient. And so this is our epidemiology. I'll show you a pie chart on the next one here that'll help sort of put this in perspective. There should not be anything terribly surprising here. Staphylococci is common. So coag negative staph is by far and away our most common isolate. It's followed by Staph aureus, and you get some gram negatives in here. So E. coli and Klebsiella, also some strep species. But what I want to also point out here, in speaking to our complex patients, 15% of ours go without a BCID detecting an organism. That's not BCID being wrong. That's some other unusual organism that's not on the list of things it's looking for. So, and here we just have an idea of where we've seen some errors here. Again, you'll see most of the errors are on the polymicrobial cultures. A handful here, this is just unfortunate math. We see so much staph, you're going to miss one every once in a while. So we're better than 99% here for the staphylococci and a handful of other, what we think are just one-off issues there. So by and large, pretty accurate. A couple of bugs I'm sure people are wondering about, how much Pseudomonas do we see? We saw 8 over this period, so really not a whole lot. Acinetobacter, Stenotrophomonas, and then I wanted to mention Candida auris. We've seen 3 individual patients with those, with Candida auris since we went live with this. Here's our pie chart, just to putting that data just in sort of visual form. You can see the staphylococci represented here, and here are the dominant organisms. One thing I think is noteworthy, and this has been true for a while, is that we don't see much strep pneumo anymore. This pie chart would have looked a lot different pre-vaccine, but that vaccine has really been a wonderful improvement here in how much invasive strep pneumo disease we've seen. So, yes, please.
Do you do the BCID only if the grant, or only if the detector detects any micro or organism, or do you do the BCID at the start regardless of blood culture?
Good question. Yes. And do I need to repeat questions? Can folks hear them over?
No, they can.
Okay, great. So what we will do is we do it after the blood culture bottle turns positive.
So you have to wait for the cut.
So we got to wait for that. So it's, that's the next step. And people are trying to make that work. That, because we do so many blood cultures, gets to be a very expensive proposition. And those systems have not gotten to the performance level that you would trust a negative. So we are not. So we're doing it right at this point.
Only once it turns positive.
Correct. Yep. Okay. Good question. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the more complicated part of this, which I think is just really sort of the science behind it is interesting. And I want to take a step back as we talk about resistance, just to kind of set the framework for what I mean by this. So we're going to be talking about beta-lactam antibiotics as one of the most commonly used antibiotics, period, especially for bacteremias. And when I'm talking about beta-lactams, really, I'm going to spell amoxicillin wrong here, evidently. Amoxicillin, piptazo, ceftriaxone, cefepime, meropenem. There are hundreds of beta-lactams, but these are the ones that we're sort of interested in looking at. And when you think about resistance to these, there's 3 main flavors of that. By far the most common in the gram negatives are going to be your beta-lactamases. And so here you have a mock-up of your gram-negative cell wall. You've got the inner membrane, the outer membrane, and the periplasmic space where the beta-lactam does its damage. It's also where the beta-lactamases are produced. You've got other mechanisms here, like changing the cell wall. The antibiotic has to get into that periplasmic space to do its damage. And so when the organism mutates to change either porins, or basically the concentration of the antibiotic in that space, you can confer resistance. But we're going to be focusing mostly on beta-lactamases because these mechanisms, these membrane changes, are really difficult to detect with molecular mechanisms. And we're doing PCR to detect certain genes here. And so these are the major beta-lactamases we see here at VCU. And there's two main sort of brands that you get. So there's what we call carbapenemases, and as the name suggests, these guys are carbapenem resistant. And then you've got your AMP-Cs and your ESBLs, and these are bad, but not as bad as the carbapenemases because at least they leave your carbapenems susceptible here. And when you look at what's on our BCID panel, fortunately, we've got markers for most of the things that we see here at VCU. So we've got the CTXM, which is the gene that looks for the ESBL. We have a KPC, which is by far and away our most common carbapenemase. And then we also have the NDM here. And so we are able to look for markers of resistance. And one of the things that's noteworthy, especially about the carbapenemases, is if you've got one of those, notice what you've got here. You're not just resistant to the carbapenems, you're resistant to everything. And this susceptible here for the monobactams, for astrine, and for NDM is actually misleading because anytime an organism has the NDM, it's also got lots of other things that make it resistant to the monobactam. So the number that are susceptible to a monobactam is like 10% or something of NDM producers. So basically, if you have any of these two enzymes, beta-lactams are off the table for the most part. So let's look at our data here. We're going to break this down into a few different organism categories that you would care about for the gram-negatives. So E. coli and Klebsiella, as you saw, are very, very common. They don't make an AMP-C enzyme. So I'm going to try and explain this as clearly as I can here. The Enterobacter, Cloacae, and Klebsiella make an AMP-C enzyme. They all have it. Whether or not they express it and make resistance is kind of a separate matter. They don't always express it, but they all have the gene. So I've indicated that here with the pluses here, just to kind of indicate the frequency of what we're looking at here. So when you get E. coli and Klebsiella, if you've got resistance, the vast majority of those are going to be due to an ESBL. If you've got an Enterobacter, Cloacae, or Klebsiella, and you've got resistance, the vast majority are going to be due to an AMP-C. And unfortunately, with Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter, which are really some of the worst bugs we see, fortunately not terribly common, they have mechanisms we can't detect with PCR. So when we're talking about the utility of this PCR, we're really focused on these organisms here. So one of the big questions we have is around piptazo and ceftriaxone usage, because those are such common antibiotics that are used here in our environment. So if we look at our gram-negatives that we got over the period of this review, so there were 301 of them, 28 or almost 10% made an ESBL. All right, so we're going to look at those a little bit. Fortunately, the carbapenemases are exceedingly rare, and this is great news because these are the mortality statistics for carbapenemase producing organisms are not good. Only 1 out of the 301 had a KPC. We didn't see any NDMs. We didn't see any other beta-lactamases that we would have missed, or carbapenemases we would have missed. So that's very good news. So let's look at the ESBLs because that's the most common thing we see. And the question we want to ask is what percentage of ESBL negative isolates are ceftriaxone resistant? And so this is a stewardship question. So another way of thinking about this is if we don't detect an ESBL with this assay, now we're looking for the CTXM gene. There are hundreds of genes, both CTXM and otherwise. We want to know if we don't detect that, do we know that the isolate is going to be ceftriaxone susceptible? Because that's the intervention. Most patients in our hospital are going to be on piptazo. If we don't detect an ESBL, can we de-escalate to something like ceftriaxone if the ESBL is not there? So in this cohort, we had 242 CTXM negative isolates. 3 of those were ceftriaxone resistant. I really wanted that number to be 0. That would have been great. Nothing is 100%, unfortunately, but that's pretty good. So if you are CTXM negative, you've got almost a 99% chance of being susceptible to ceftriaxone. So that is what it is. The next number I think is even more interesting. So piptazo, which most patients would be on, was actually more likely to be resistant in this patient population. So if, for the sake of argument, our empiric drug of choice is piptazo and a patient's on piptazo, you're actually better off switching to ceftriaxone because you're more likely to have activity there. It's kind of interesting. Looking at the inverse of that, so if you're CTX positive, if you have this ESBL, it's exactly what you'd expect. 100% ceftriaxone resistant. Found this to be a little interesting. So about 3/4 of our isolates were also cefepime resistant. I expected that to be a little higher. And then only 11%, I actually expected this to be a little higher as well. Only 11% of our ESBL positive isolates were piptazo resistant. So that also is kind of interesting. And looking at Piptazo specifically, because that's such a commonly used antibiotic here, if we break down organisms, there's really two categories. Getting back to that first table I showed, there's AMP-C producers, which is this top data. This is kind of interesting. So in the ESBL negative AMP-C organisms, so your Enterobacter cloacae, Cleverogenes, and Citrobacter frundii, 1 in 5 are actually resistant to Piptazo. That's a little higher number than I thought. Our stewardship group, I think, is looking at these data and deciding what we want to do with this. But that's interesting. Sort of, we only had one, but the one ESBL positive isolate was Piptazo susceptible. I don't know what to do with that. It's a low number. If we look at our E. coli's and our Klebsiellas here, if there's no ESBL, again, this is the same data I just showed you there. If there's no ESBL detected, almost 97% are susceptible, but 3.3% were resistant. And if it's ESBL positive, 11% were Piptazo resistant. All right, this is just breaking down the species here. This is exactly what you would expect from the literature. So the majority of ESBL producers are E. coli, followed closely by Klebsiella, and there's really not much else. We saw one in a Proteus, and then we also saw one in an Enterobacter cloacae. So by far and away, your most likely ESBL producers are going to be your Klebsiella pneumoniae and E. coli. Last quick thing on resistance here for the BCID is looking at Enterococcus. Really important designation is vancomycin resistance, of course. So the VAN-A-B gene predicts vancomycin resistance. We're pretty confident if you've got that gene, you've got vancomycin resistance. Little less confident that if you don't have that gene, similar question to the ESBL, can we know that you are vancomycin susceptible? And so that's the question we were asking here. Nice clean data set here. So over the period of this review, we had 60 Enterococcus bloodstream infections split perfectly down the middle between VCM and VCUHS. We had 26 that had this gene. All of those were resistant and nice and clean. 34 that did not. All of those were susceptible. So you can be very confident that if you get an Enterococcus and we don't detect this gene, vancomycin is okay. And then the inverse, obviously, if we detect vancomycin resistance, that it is going to be resistant. If you look down at the breakdown of the species here, so this shouldn't be surprising. VCM is by far and away our most common cause of vancomycin resistant infections here. You can see we didn't see a single case of Enterococcus faecalis that was vancomycin resistant. It does happen. I think our antibiogram suggests maybe 2% of our faecalis are vancomycin resistant, but in this cohort, all of them were susceptible and up to 90% of VCM. And I believe that's higher than our antibiogram suggests. So if you took all Enterococcus VCM, about 80%, I believe, are vancomycin resistant. We're almost 90% here for a bloodstream infection. So that's not great. But it is what it is. And this is one I'm particularly proud of here. So this will be the last slide on BCID, but this is the impact on time to results. So the average time to a positive blood culture for E. coli is about 12 hours. And that's from the time of phlebotomy. So from the time you do phlebotomy to the time we get a positive result off our system. So that includes transport time to the lab and everything. I just wanted to know, what is the physician experiencing? 12 hours for E. coli. That thing is moving. That's very, very fast. Staph aureus is a little bit slower. So 20 hours for Staph aureus. If you add on the 2 hours or so it takes us to do the BCID, we're at now 14 hours to get a time to organism identification and some molecular clues as to what the resistance means for that organism. Our conventional blood culture methods take 42 hours to get to an organism identification. So we're improved by well over a day here. So something that we really hope is improving patient care. Not much has changed with respect to phenotypic susceptibility testing. We're still at 62 hours here, though we are looking down the road and trying to identify some rapid susceptibility systems that can be done closer to this time frame here. So we'll see. That's future state. I do want to point out our antimicrobial stewardship group has been wonderful to help us get this going, to advise us, and to help make sure we're having the maximal impact on patient care. What they're doing is they're reviewing the BCID results in real time. If it comes in over evening and night shift, they'll get it first thing in the morning. If appropriate, they will send an Epic chat for possible changes. And they're following these results very, very closely. And I want to give a special thanks to the whole team there, but especially Doctors Sangeeta Sastry and Aaron Deja, who've just been really helpful in getting us up and going with this.
Chris?
Yes.
I think I asked about this before when we were first talking about this.
Yeah.
A year or two ago. So we often send repeat cultures to see that they've cleared and are waiting on negative cultures for various, things to put in PICC lines and all sorts.
Yes.
Is there any progression of thinking about how BCID might help us be able to make those decisions sooner. We typically wait for 48 hours of negative cultures. If we could just do 24 hours because the BCID was negative, that might help, particularly when we already know what the bug is.
Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately not. This is downstream from that particular question in order for BCID to do anything. Now, you could imagine, and this is theoretical, a scenario where you would pull a blood culture bottle that's negative at, let's say, 24 hours, and you did a PCR, and you might have enhanced detection there. It'd be a pretty manual, clunky thing to do and expensive. So I can't imagine a scenario where we would do that just yet. But unfortunately, this time, it's not going to help with that question. One thing I hope to talk to you all about next year, if I get to do this again, is some new advances in blood culture media, which are better in enhanced detection of organisms so that they detect them much more quickly and with greater sensitivity. So I think we're going to get to a point where we can say that 48 hours is now 24 or something along those lines. Also a little bit theoretical, but there's some really impressive new technology that we're exploring right now for that. It's a good question. So yet another seamless segue into Dale, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Into a different topic, I guess related to blood cultures here, but something that you may or may not have noticed is we've changed the way we culture for fungus and mycobacteria in blood. And specifically, we've made some changes in the fungal blood culture. This is a picture, this is, 10 years down the road, trainees will have no idea what I'm talking about here, but we've been doing this forever, where in order to do a fungal or a mycobacterial blood culture, you can't incubate it in the same bottles we do for bacteria. The systems haven't been designed to do that yet. And so we take the blood and we have to centrifuge it because you can't put 10 mils of blood onto a plate. It's a mess. And so this system we've been using forever, you put the blood into this tube and it comes into this weird centrifuge style thing where we're able to concentrate the organism, discard the excess blood, and then plate it on a plate. Very manual. And the last thing you want to do if you're looking for things like a fungus, because that's an error-prone process to begin with. So we've been doing this forever, really manual, and probably not all that sensitive. And so they finally discontinued this. They no longer make it. So they took it out of our hands, and we've moved to a newer system here, which looks just like our routine blood cultures. It's the same style of bottle, only it's designed to grow mycobacteria and fungi, and it works great. So we've recently shifted to this. It goes on a continuously monitored system, which for us is great because when it was this style of microbiology, we had to look at every one of these plates every day. It's way less prone to contamination because it's a closed system now. And we think it's been a really positive impact. And as I talk about this, I want to just share some of the data around this because we think there's been probably some misunderstanding around how fungal blood cultures ought to be used. And so we thought this was a good opportunity for some improvement here. This is a review of VCU data just up until prior to the pandemic, a 10-year review over which we had done over 21,000 blood cultures, about 6 per day, which is high, actually. That's probably more than we ought to be doing. And over that time, our positivity rate is 0.14%. So that's not great. That's not high yield. Made worse by the fact that some of these are likely contaminants. We can't know for sure, but because of the way we handle these cultures, we do our best not to contaminate them. But you can imagine we have an entire laboratory dedicated to growing molds, which are some of the most sporulating, floating things there are. And so things happen, things get on plates, but the consequences of ignoring a possible cause of fungal bacteremia or fungal bloodstream infection, too much to ignore, so we report them. Clearly, histoplasma is real. Fusarium is real. Cryptococcus would be real. Anything else on this list, questionable. But this is the data we got here. And what we saw in looking at some of these data, and Dr. Mahali has been really helpful in looking at these data, is what we would commonly see is this pattern where somebody would do a regular blood culture, grow Candida, and switch to doing the fungal blood culture, which I understand completely why that would be done. The name suggests that's what you should do, not the right thing to do. The routine blood culture is actually the better way of growing Candida. And so we think that confusion is something we're trying to clean up a little bit here. I'm going to skip this slide here because this is a representation of it. So this is something I've been interested in for a while. So my past life, I was a director in Children's Medical Center in Dallas. We did a similar analysis to look at the relative yield of the routine blood culture versus the isolator culture. And we partnered with sick kids up in Toronto to generate these data. And you can see the routine blood culture actually does really well for a lot of things. It's not going to grow histo. So that's something where your fungal blood culture is going to be better for doing that. But for most things, even fusarium, surprisingly, which is by far and away the most common cause of fungal bloodstream infection, especially in our environment, the routine blood culture does just fine. When you look at VCU Health and we looked at the breakdown, you can see that our isolator tubes in this little evaluation grew fusarium in 5 out of 20,000 cultures, and actually we're more likely to get it out of a routine blood culture here. That might suggest that we shouldn't use an isolator culture or a fungal culture to get fusarium. That's probably not true. If you're suspecting fusarium, you ought to do a fungal blood culture. And I'll explain to you how we're trying to guide people here. So this should say recent changes instead of pending changes, because we've gone live with this. We've changed the name from our culture from fungal blood culture to mold blood culture now, hopefully to steer people more towards less looking for yeast, more looking for filamentous fungal molds. We've also put in here some instructions which suggest you should not use this culture for Canada. I don't know how often these things get read. I know everyone's very busy with ordering tests and clicking on a bunch of things. The goal was to hopefully provide a little guidance that really the best place to use this mold blood culture now, really immunocompromised patients when you're looking for things like fusarium or histoplasma. That's it. These are the data, and thanks to Dr. Mahali for putting this together. So it's a little messy looking data, but it tells the story. So this is our pre-intervention, pre-name change, and all we've done is change the name and put this out here along with some, probably an email that went out to the university. Even I myself probably deleted. So here we got the change though. So the green line is our intervention. This is the average usage here prior to intervention. And this purple line, our goal was this orange line. And you can see we actually have, for this short period of time we've been doing it, exceeded our goal here. So we've dropped our utilization here. Now we're going to look at this very closely and see, is this having the intended effect? You want to make sure there's not some sort of unintended consequence, but we think this is probably driven more appropriate use for this testing here, which is great. So going to shift gears here just to a few future directions here. Got about 20 minutes left. That should be about perfect. A couple of quick things here. So we've got a new automated susceptibility testing system. Not going to get in the logistics of that. The important thing for us is it automates a pretty manual workflow. The important thing for you all is our results should come back much quicker. So that's great. We are in the final stages of validating new specimen sources that folks have been asking for a long while for GC and chlamydia PCR testing from rectal and pharyngeal specimens. So that should be ready to go live here in the next month or so. And then a few other things here. So I'm going to talk about a few of these. We're looking at digital technologies to read malaria smears remotely. That's more of a thing for me because oftentimes these smears have to be reviewed, and it would be better if I could do it from a computer at home than coming into the hospital. And so we're looking to do things like that. The two that I want to focus on here is the blood culture diversion for limiting blood culture contamination and a meningitis encephalitis panel. So talk about blood culture contamination, something that impacts anyone who's done a blood culture probably. Just to put our data in perspective, so on a monthly basis, we do a little over 3,000 blood cultures. This is part of a report, incidentally, that we generate every month and report to infection control. So this is something we watch very closely. You can see about 3,000 blood cultures a month. You'll notice it always goes up in July. I'm sure you guys can guess why that is. Our highest month is always July. You'd think it would be December. It's not. It's July. Our overall contamination rate in this institution is actually pretty good, hovering around 1.5%. What we're going to focus on with respect to this project is the emergency department. And every emergency department in the world has the highest contamination rate in the environment. It's a chaotic environment, a lot going on down there. That is not at all to bang on our ED colleagues. In fact, these numbers are actually far better than most emergency departments you'll find, as the next slide will show. But it's still an area and an opportunity for improvement, because they also do the majority of our blood cultures. Each month, they do about 1/3 of our blood cultures. So it's a place where we can potentially intervene and have a positive impact. This is a study, I believe this was in Nebraska. I don't recall now off the top of my head. So what these guys did is they did a study to look at blood culture diversion. I'll share with you what diversion is here in a second. They had their historical contamination rate. This is our emergency department. So now we're starting to look pretty good. So our ED sits around 3, sometimes less than 3%. These guys are at 7%. That's, I mean, that's almost 1 in 10 blood cultures are contaminated. That's not good. They did a QI project, and that really didn't do anything. And so that's unfortunately the reality of, you can educate and try and, improve technique. It's only going to get you so far. And then they implemented blood culture diversion, and they dropped their blood cultures contamination rate to less than 1%. And it was all the bugs that you would expect. So they reduced all of the common contaminants, most commonly co-negative staph, but also Micrococcus, Corynebacterium. and Cutibacterium. So you can see the differences before and after the intervention. So we don't know which one's best for us yet. We're going to do I think we've got a nice study lined up to try and do this with the emergency department. There's two main devices. Curin is, and they both work kind of the same way. The idea is, even if you sterilize the skin perfectly, when you go to do your phlebotomy, you've still got to go through this space here, and organisms exist below that, the dermis there, and they can still lead to contamination. So they would say that it's impossible to eliminate contamination unless you eliminate this. How are we going to do that? Well, through diversion. So what happens is you have this little device that sits between the patient and the blood culture bottle, and the first little bit of blood gets diverted and sequestered. So the first little bit of blood comes over here, then it seals, and then the rest of it bypasses it and goes into the blood culture bottle. So not only do you eliminate the organisms that live here, also if you missed any on the skin, it's going to get those as well. This is another device that does basically the same thing. The two main differences between these two companies is this product here requires a physical closing of that device. And so there's an extra step. It's a minimal one, but it's an extra step. We do about 50,000 blood cultures a year. So even little steps you have to be careful about adding into the workflow here. So we want to see if this workflow is acceptable. This guy, Curin, there is no extra step. It's just everything that we would do normally. It just sort of passively takes the blood. The other big difference is there's a lot of data suggesting that this one works. There's not as much data for Curin. And the difference, there is a reason to think that maybe this one works better because it takes more blood. And so they would say, you've got to take 2.5 mils for this to work. The Curin folks only take 0.5 mil, which is great for pediatrics, but we don't know if it's going to work. There's not as much data in the literature about it. And here's the analysis of these guys. So we do about 14,000 blood cultures a year in our emergency department with an average contamination rate of 2.5%, 2.7%. That's 372 contaminated blood cultures a year. The literature would suggest, and this is a conservative estimate, that each contaminated blood culture costs us about $4,000 per patient for a contaminated culture. It's probably closer to 5,000. If you do that math, 372 times 4K is $1.5 million a year, presumably lost due to contaminated blood cultures. A diversion device costs $20. So that's about $250,000 spent on diversion devices. So what do we need to do in order for us to break even on that? We've got to eliminate 70 blood cultures in order to get that. That would be a contamination rate from 2.7 down to 2.2%. Easily doable by any literature you look at. That's easily doable. Probably will get down to 1%, which would be a cost avoidance of about $1 million. A little bit of a tough sell because this comes out of everybody's bucket. There's no one place that money comes from. We're going to spend a heck of a lot more money doing blood cultures, and we're going to have to agree that this is overall a benefit financially. So we'll see. We're going to do the study first and see which system works, if they do work in our hands, and see where we go from there. So hopefully next year I've got some good updates to share with you, these data from this study, and hopefully we've been able to go live with one of them. Last quick thing here before I get into our lab utilization efforts. We are hoping to implement, and do I have until the top of the hour? Or do I need to beat it up? It's 12. That's okay. Yeah. All right. I'll try and get done here in the next 10 minutes or so. So we are going to implement a meningitis panel here. So this is similar to our blood culture PCR, similar to our respiratory pathogen panels. This is a multiplex panel that looks for all of these different pathogens from CSF. Same workflow, couple of hours, and the results will be there. It sits on the same instrument we do all these guys on, but there are some questionable things about this assay. So it's got a rapid turnaround time, but it's got variable sensitivity for some pathogens. And the big question is, can you trust a negative? Do I have data on this next slide? I do. Yeah. Real quick before I move on, something I just wanted to mention, I just couldn't help myself, a little PSA. This is critical for the laboratory to do what we do, is to know what the specimen is and to do that with accuracy. One place that really causes fits for us is incorrect designation of what the CSF is. Is it a lumbar puncture? Is it from a reservoir? Is it from a shunt? We do very different things. We look for different organisms. So getting that right, we've reviewed these and we find that it's fairly inaccurate. And so we're looking at the system in ways that we can help drive this to be more accurate. But just as I was talking about CSF, I couldn't help myself. I wanted to mention that. This is the data. These are from meta-analyses here looking at this biofire meningitis panel. You'll notice we're not in a range where you're trusting negative results. So the sensitivity of this is all well below 95%. So what does that mean? If you miss 1 in 4, 1 in 5 HSV1s with this, is that good enough? Probably not. So we're moving to this panel because it is fast. Positive results are quick and very trustable. You can see the specificities are good. There's virtually no issue with false positives here, maybe a little bit with strep pneumo. But strep pneumo is a hard organism to culture. So that I think in some cases, this is probably better than culture. We're struggling with a little bit about how to roll this out because you got to be careful reflexing and mandating things. The billing and compliance side of that is really challenging. So I want to share with you, this is coming. We'll have more information. We're going to do this, what form it takes and how we reflex and what guidance we provide around it. We're not quite sure yet. But next year, we'll be able to talk about how that's going for us here. So just a little bit of a heads up there. I think in general, we're very excited about this. I don't want to pour cold water on this because it's a really powerful assay. We're going to go from a 48-hour turnaround time to hours here. So the positives are going to come back quick and hopefully be very impactful. All right, so last quick thing here, just going to touch base on, and I mentioned some of this at last year's discussion, is our laboratory utilization committee. First, kind of want to update you on what the committee is. So the key components to the committee, the most important part is to find two suckers to take responsibility for this and look to anger the entire organization by implementing things that they know nothing about. So we found those people. I'm one of them. My good colleague, Dr. Chelsea Kidd, is the other. So we've got that down. We also got great support from our hospital leadership. This has really been important. We've tried to do this a couple of different times, and the current leadership group is very supportive of what we're trying to do. And that's really, really helpful. We've got a multidisciplinary committee, and this saves us from ourselves. So we've got, all kidding aside, the most important thing is to have people outside of the laboratory that know their different areas and to solicit and use their input. So we've got a really good committee. We've got a charter. We've got policies that have now been approved. So all these things now, we've got a real committee that's functioning. We're meeting monthly, and we're trying to make things better. So the fear, I think, is you get committees like this, and we're going to be obstructive and slow things down. We realize this is a complicated environment. Our job is to make sure that we're using tests appropriately, not to make it harder to do things. And one of the big places we're focusing here is on miscellaneous testing. Now, I'll talk about a few things we're focusing on, but this is a big financial issue. Our motivation, speaking for Dr. Kidd and myself, is to make testing better. I don't particularly care if we save a lot of money. I think that would be nice if we do. That's not why I'm doing this. But we spend a ton of money sending testing outside of our four walls. So we spend over $7 million a year in referral lab testing. It's a big number. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here. So the one we're going to focus on here is miscellaneous testing. We're going to create a test formulary around that, and I'll describe that in greater detail. We've also got a huge number of labs that are uncontracted, and that's a big issue because these are labs that we basically have no formal relationship that we send patient information to. That's a big compliance risk. We also want to create a process for prior authorization to make sure our patients are actually getting testing that's being reimbursed. That's tricky. We think we're close to having a process. I'm really optimistic that next time we talk, we'll have a beautiful algorithm for how that's going to work. It should be easy, and we're going to be taking care of that for folks. So testing will be paid for. And then kit testing. Can't even get into that one. This is a big fish. There's a lot of testing that happens in our organization that we never see in pathology. And that's fine. We're happy not to own it, but there's a lot of challenges with that. Where does that result go? How is it ordered? How do we follow up on those results? How are they paid for? Do patients get stuck with things? So there's a lot of systems around that make it work well for patients, but there's also a lot of things that we need to consider there. So we're hoping that we can facilitate that and make it easier, but this is a big issue that we're looking at here. But I want to just focus on the next last couple of minutes here on what we're doing with the miscellaneous testing. So what is a miscellaneous test? It's a catch-all. This is for, we try to build an order that has a place to go in the medical record. This is for anything we haven't built. It's a generic order. It's a problem because it leads to non-standardized ordering. There's no interface for it. So these results go out to a reference lab. We're backed up several weeks. We got a fax machine, and I'm not kidding. It's a fax machine where these results sit, and we have to scan them in. And there's no place to find these tests. And the data is messy around it. This is my son, Jonathan, here. He's got a touch of OCD as well. And I was, in preparation for a version of this talk, I was reviewing these data. And you just look at the different ways that even just CMV susceptibility testing is. And it was bothering him. He's like, Dad, what's going on here? Is this how your hospital works? I'm like, yeah, buddy, this is how it works. And so it makes it hard for us to know what's going on. And so this is also one of the problems is, so here's our catch-all miscellaneous test. And this is what it looks like. You have no idea what each one of these miscellaneous tests is. How in the world can you know if something's been done unless you go back and review every single one of them? Something that certainly can be done, but we're all busy people. So we hope that this will improve it. What are we doing about it? We're going to build all the miscellaneous tests, or we're hoping to. Anything that's been done with any kind of regularity, and we're starting with the most frequent ones here. This is just a list of tests, I believe, that were sent to the Mayo Clinic, and we're building them. And so now, instead of ordering this as a miscellaneous test, it will be a defined place. It'll go to a single lab too, which will also standardize the quality. And they should come back much faster and be much easier to see. And so we've made some good progress here. So we've built 56 different tests. And this is a challenge for us, is trying to let the environment know. This is part of why I'm glad to have this opportunity. I can't give you the laundry list of 56. There's no efficient way to communicate that to folks. We're doing the best we can. We're going to probably look at some pathology newsletters to maybe do this, but there's 56 tests, soon to be many, many more. And we've got 17 in progress, 25 more that have been requested, and 100 others that we're going to try and do. So we're making our way through it. And the good news is people are using these, despite the fact that we've probably not done enough to communicate that we're doing this. These are the tests that have been built, or at least some of them. And you can see they're all being done with some frequency, and the frequency is roughly equivalent to what they were being used before. So we don't think we've driven, this is something we hope to do, is it makes it a lot easier to monitor once we do this. And so we can identify places where they may not be used appropriately or optimally. And so you can see I've just done a little ratio calculation here to see what the ratio is. This is the before we built the test and after, and utilization is roughly tracks. There's a few places where it's different here, but anyway, we think we're making some good progress there. And the last thing I'll just say before I end is we need help with this. Our goal is to make testing better and easier. So our environment knows better in most cases where the issues might lie. So please reach out to us. We've actually created an email. You can reach out to us. This goes to a few different folks that monitor this, just as an example to get folks thinking about this. So we realized the director of operations, Roxanne Mercer, noticed this, that we do a really high percentage of pregnancy tests on males. And so that's an issue. So we looked into that. It's probably driven by an order set that's pre-checked. So pretty easy fix, we think, although we want to be careful about this. You never know what the unintended consequences are. So rest assured, we're not doing any of this unilaterally or without talking to people that are invested in this. So we don't want to create more problems than we solve. But if you notice things like this, please let us know. We want to fix whatever we can here. So with that, I did pretty close to ending on time here. Always want to thank my team. We're a big costume group. We do really like the holidays here. So we've got just a wonderful group here in pathology in general and micro specifically. This is my colleague, Dr. Bryson here, partner in crime, Aaron, our manager, and a whole host of other really good folks. And with that, I will answer, be happy to take questions here, but really appreciate the opportunity to do this. This is really beneficial for us. So thank you.
Anybody good questions?
And I don't know if there's a chat. You have the chat up there. Okay.
Questions from the audience here?
Chris, you mentioned compliance issues with decreasing the number of testing. And I would think in payers, we're more concerned with going the other way with spending too much money. And I do feel like there's a lot of things that we order, I'll come in the morning and the residents say, well, we ordered this overnight. I said, well, okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I know that's an expensive test. The stool pathogen panel is the one that probably drives me the most nuts.
Yeah.
How do we get smarter about recognizing how much these tests cost and how little utility they seem to have?
That's a good question. That's kind of where we start with. That's usually our point of entry, unfortunately, is just cost of tests. It's usually a pretty good place to start. And we've experimented with dollar signs. We've experimented. This was the Cerner world, and then it broke when we went to Epic, and we hope to get back to it. But just a simple dollar sign scale, not to say what the absolute number is, but like $1 sign, $2 signs. We had a lot of luck doing that with testosterone testing. There's two kinds of testosterone testing: the expensive wrong kind and the cheap right kind. And so we just did $1 sign and $4 signs, and it flipped it because our utilization was about even. And so I think strategies like that can help people just be a little bit more educated about what the cost of tests are. We also want to let people know when they're being sent out. We think that might be an impactful thing because there's no way you guys as a provider can reasonably know what's done in-house and what's not. And we think that alone might give people pause, like, hey, send out tests, 2-week turnaround time or something like that, where it might just give people pause. But it's a good question. We're hoping that Epic will give us tools, and we're going to meet with our new CMIO, who has a lot of experience with this, to hopefully pick his brain on some ideas there. So, and we're welcome to suggestions. Do you think there are things we can do that make it clear, or there's information that's not obvious? We're all for it. Okay, it's a big issue. The other thing we see, and we are a learning environment, and we acknowledge that there is a lot of resident anticipating what an attending might want, and that's okay. That's part of the learning process here. We're not trying to shut all that down, but maybe a little stops and pauses every once in a while will be okay. It's a good question though.
I have a question on point of care testing.
Yeah.
Be it glucose or pregnancy, your pregnancy data made me think of that.
Yeah.
And who oversees that?
Yeah.
And how is that entered into the EHR?
Yeah. That we actually have a whole group dedicated to overseeing the performance of point of care testing, which is just to make sure it's done right when it's done. I don't think there is a whole lot of attention paid to your question there, which is how it's being used and, and is it appropriate? And that's a good question. I can ask that. I don't know. That's outside.
I was just curious.
It's a good one because it's a huge volume of testing that gets done in that.
Right, well, because the only reason I bring it up is I once had a study patient who needed a negative pregnancy test. It was done in the ED as a point of care, but it was never entered in Epic. Or it might have been Cerner, I can't
Yeah.
remember. So anyway, it led to this huge regulatory problem and, we solved it, but
It is, point of care testing is a blessing and a curse because it gives you good access to rapid results here. But I will say we have, it's a small army, but it's a dedicated group of people designed or tasked just with making sure things like that get done correctly.
and entered,
And
yeah.
it's just so, yeah, I mean, that's a fundamental thing that
Right.
is a challenge with point of care that's not in the laboratory. So,
Right, right.
yeah, so I don't have a better answer for you, but it's one of the more challenging things we deal with.
Oh, it's just congratulations, great talk, Dr. Symes.
Oh.
Good job. Dr. Kidd said if there's any test you would like us to look into for cost or otherwise, shoot us an email.
Yep.
So.
All right, so
Yep.
no wayward, no constructive criticism in there in the chat.
No.
All right, great.
Well,
Very
thank
good.
you so